She thought she was cooking dinner for the man she loved. Instead, she was sitting across from a ghost, a man who had already planned her funeral before her baby even took its first breath. One unlocked phone, one Thanksgiving night, one woman who would never be the same again. This is the story of Isabella Ashcroft, a pregnant wife who discovered that the empire built around her was also built against her. And what she did next will leave you breathless. Stay until the end, like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The turkey had been in the oven since 2 in the afternoon. Isabella knew this because she had checked on it 4 times, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, the kind of domestic rhythm she had quietly learned to love over the past 3 years of marriage. The smell of rosemary and slow roasting fat filled the kitchen of their Upper West Side penthouse, and for a moment, just a moment, the world felt exactly the way she had always wanted it to feel. Warm, contained, safe. She was 24 weeks pregnant. Her ankles had started swelling in the mornings. Her lower back ached in a way no amount of stretching could fix. But she moved through the kitchen carefully, deliberately, the way a woman moves when she has finally made peace with the life she chose. She had not always been at peace. There were years before Lucienne when she had been adrift in a way that people with money sometimes are, the kind of loss that nobody around you can see because the outside of your life looks too clean. Her father, William Ashcroft, had built a shipping and logistics empire over 4 decades of brutal, honest work. When he died 2 years before she met Lucienne, he left her not just money, but a legacy, a set of documents, trusts, legal instruments she barely understood at 22, and a piece of advice she had half forgotten by the time grief gave way to living again. The people who want your love and your empire at the same time, her father had told her once, sitting at the kitchen table of the Connecticut house, drinking black coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug, will always pretend one of them doesn't exist. She hadn't known what he meant then. She would. Lucian Blackwood arrived in her life at a charity gala when she was 26. He was 41. He had the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of voice that rooms respond to. Low, unhurried, certain of itself. He was already a well-known figure in Manhattan shipping and private equity circles, and the story he told, self-made, disciplined, driven, was the kind of story that made women like Isabella, women who had grown up watching their fathers build things from nothing, feel something close to recognition. What she felt was not recognition. She understood that now, standing at the kitchen counter, pressing a hand against the side of her belly where the baby had been shifting restlessly all afternoon. What she had felt was projection. She had looked at Lucian Blackwood and seen her father. That mistake had cost her 3 years. She heard the elevator open in the foyer, Lucienne's private elevator, the one that went directly from the underground parking level to their floor, and she felt the familiar small tightening in her chest that she had been ignoring for months. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was late pregnancy nerves. She told herself a lot of things. He came into the kitchen already wearing his coat. "I have to go," he said. That was it. No greeting. No glance at the table she had set with the good china, the candles already lit, the small handwritten card at his place setting that said, "Happy Thanksgiving" in her careful handwriting. He was looking at his phone. Isabella turned slowly from the counter. "It's Thanksgiving, Lucienne. I know what day it is. Dinner's almost ready. There's an issue with the Rotterdam port contract. Chen's team needs me on a call tonight." He finally looked up briefly, in the way that people look at someone they have already stopped seeing. "I won't be long." She wanted to push. She felt the push building somewhere behind her sternum, 3 years of small surrenders stacking up behind it like pressure behind a dam. But she had learned, somewhere along the way, that pushing Lucienne on nights like this produced nothing useful. He became cold and precise and somehow made her feel that the problem was always her timing, her emotion, her inability to understand the weight of what he carried. "Fine," she said. He kissed her forehead. His lips were dry. He smelled like the same cologne he always wore, and she noticed, in the distracted way of someone cataloging small details without meaning to, that he had recently showered. His hair was still slightly damp at the temples. He had showered before coming home. She filed that away without examining it and went back to the oven. The elevator closed. She stood in the kitchen for a full 3 minutes without moving, her hand resting on the oven door handle, the smell of rosemary filling the silence around her. Then she heard it, a buzz, soft, repeating. She followed the sound to the dining table and found his phone sitting face up beside the candles, screen lighting and fading in a pulse. He had left it. In 4 years of knowing Lucien Blackwood, she had never once seen him leave his phone behind. The device was practically an extension of his hand. He checked it in elevators, at dinner tables once. She remembered this specifically, at her father's memorial. She stared at it for a long moment. Later, she would not be able to tell you exactly what she felt in that moment, because the honest answer is that she felt almost nothing. No dramatic premonition, no clenching dread. She was tired and her back hurt, and the turkey needed another 20 minutes, and she picked up the phone the way you pick up something that belongs to someone you trust, meaning to set it somewhere safe. The screen was unlocked. He had not locked it before he left, or the lock timer had not yet engaged, and the most recent message sat visible at the top of the thread without her having to touch anything. Tonight was perfect. Miss you already. When are you telling her? The sender's name was Celeste Rowan. Isabella knew the name. Everyone in their world knew the name. Celeste Rowan was Blackwood Global's head of public relations. 34, polished, aggressively competent, the kind of woman who made other women feel slightly underdressed at company events. Isabella had shaken her hand at 3 separate corporate dinners and always walked away with the uncomfortable sense that the handshake meant something different to Celeste than it did to her. She set the phone back down on the table. She looked at the candles. She picked the phone back up. What she told herself in that moment was that she was going to look at one message. That was the arrangement she made with herself, standing there in the candlelight with her 24-week belly and her swollen ankles and her rosemary turkey. One message, just to understand what she was looking at. She looked at the first message, then the second. Then she sat down in one of the dining chairs and kept reading, and she did not get up for a very long time. The thread went back 14 months. She did not read every message that night. There were hundreds, entire days of communication compressed into dense blocks of text and image attachments. But she read enough. She read what she needed to read in the way that people sometimes absorb catastrophic information. Not all at once, but in a sequence of small impacts, each one landing just as the previous one begins to settle. There were photographs, hotel rooms in various cities, London, Dubai, Zurich, and at least twice in downtown Manhattan. Celeste in various states of intimacy. Lucien's handwriting on a room service receipt photographed as a joke. A small private joke between 2 people who had been sharing small private jokes for over a year while Isabella was in Connecticut, attending prenatal appointments alone, because Lucien was always traveling. There were financial records, screenshots of transactions she didn't immediately understand, transfers between entities she didn't recognize, a name that appeared repeatedly, Ashcroft Holdings. Her name, her father's name, moving through accounts she had never authorized. And there were voice messages. 2 of them, saved as audio files attached to text messages between Lucien and Celeste, the kind of thing people send when they want a record of a plan. She did not play them in the dining room. She took the phone to the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and put the phone against her ear with the water running. Lucien's voice, low and precise and unhurried, the way it always was, calm in the way of someone who has never been asked to account for their calm. After the baby's born, we need to move fast. The trust is the only complication. Once we have the birth certificate and I've established paternity on record, we push for guardianship review. She's not equipped, Celeste. I'll make sure the record reflects that. Postpartum. Emotional instability. It's not difficult to document. And then Celeste's voice, lower, more careful. And the assets? The assets move in Q1. By the time she understands what happened, it'll be restructured beyond recovery. She doesn't know what she holds. Her father never told her. A pause. She's a liability after the birth. The child too, eventually, if she gets in the way. We just need to be patient. Isabella sat on the edge of the bathtub with the phone against her ear for a long time after the recording ended. The water was still running. She became aware of her own breathing, the specific texture of it, the way it had gone very shallow without her noticing, the way her hand was gripping the edge of the tub hard enough that the porcelain rim was leaving a ridge across her palm. She became aware of the baby moving, a slow rolling shift, the kind of movement that had been making her smile for weeks, and she pressed her free hand against her belly without thinking, the automatic gesture of a woman who had already learned to protect something. She did not cry. She would be surprised by this later. The absence of tears in that first hour. But grief and terror are not always wet. Sometimes they are dry and cold and very, very clear. She stood up. She turned off the water. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink for a long moment, the way you look at your own face when you're trying to understand exactly what version of yourself you're about to need. Then she walked back to the kitchen and turned off the oven. The turkey didn't matter anymore. She spent the next 2 hours going through the phone systematically, the way her father had taught her to review contracts, not looking for emotion, looking for evidence. She screenshotted everything she could find, the message threads, the photographs, the financial records, the names of the shell companies, the account numbers, the timestamps on hotel reservations that corresponded with business trips she had waved him off on herself, standing in this same hallway, telling him to be safe, telling him she'd be fine. She found encrypted folders with file names that meant nothing to her yet, but clearly meant something to someone. AHT Restructure V3, Port Transfer Docs, IB Post-Birth Protocol. IB. Her initials. Her hands were steady. She noticed this about herself, the steadiness, and filed it away the same way she had filed away the damp hair at his temples. Data. All of it was just data now. By midnight, she had filled 2 encrypted drives she found in Lucien's home office, the drives he used for what he called sensitive business files, which she now understood was a phrase that had been doing a great deal of work for a very long time. She used his own laptop to copy everything because his laptop was already authenticated to the secure cloud accounts, and she understood just enough about how these systems worked to know that her window was limited. She worked in the dark. She didn't turn on lights. She didn't want to see the apartment she had decorated, the apartment where she had assembled the crib in the room at the end of the hall, the apartment where she had believed sincerely and completely that she was building something real. At 2 a.m, she sat on the floor of the nursery with the 2 drives in her hand and the baby blanket she had been knitting for 6 weeks folded in her lap. Pale yellow, half finished, the needles still stuck through the yarn. She had been knitting it in the evenings while Lucien worked late. She had been happy doing it. That was the thing she kept coming back to, sitting there on the nursery floor. She had been genuinely happy. She thought about her father, about what he had known or suspected that she hadn't, about the trust documents he had referenced in his will, documents she had signed and filed and largely ignored because she was 22 and grieving, and the attorneys had told her not to worry, that everything was structured properly, that she was protected. She doesn't know what she holds. Her father never told her, but someone did know. Someone who had been in her father's circle, someone who understood the legal architecture of the Ashcroft family's holdings better than she did. Someone her father had trusted with information he hadn't trusted to her yet because she had been too young, and then he had run out of time. Gideon Voss. The name surfaced from a place she hadn't visited in years. Gideon Voss had been her father's oldest friend and legal strategist, a gray, precise, intensely private man who had attended her father's funeral in a black coat and said almost nothing to anyone and disappeared back into whatever quiet life he had built after leaving public practice. She remembered him at the reception afterward, standing slightly apart from the room, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. She had his number in an address book her father had given her, an actual paper address book, which she had thought was old-fashioned and sweet and had kept in the bottom drawer of her bedside table without thinking about it again. She got up from the nursery floor. She got the address book. She sat down on the bed in the dark bedroom where she and Lucien slept, where he had slept, at least on the nights he was actually here, and she found Gideon Voss's name on the 3rd page, a phone number and a handwritten note in her father's handwriting beside it, for when it matters. And it will matter. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she looked at the clock on the nightstand. 2:17 a.m. She looked at the 2 encrypted drives in her hand. She thought about Lucien coming home, about the specific way he would come in, the way he always came in late, quietly, certain that she was asleep, certain that the version of her he had constructed in his mind was the version sitting in that penthouse, soft, uninformed, safe to underestimate. She thought about what happened to women who stayed in apartments with men who had described them as liabilities. She looked back at the number in the address book. She picked up her phone, not his, and she dialed. It rang 3 times. A voice answered. Quiet, alert, completely unsurprised, as though the call had been expected for years. Isabella, she exhaled, just once. A slow, controlled breath that released something she had been holding since she first read that message in the candlelight. He left his phone, she said. I found everything. A pause. Not the pause of a man who is surprised, the pause of a man who is choosing his first word carefully. How long do you have before he comes back? I don't know, maybe hours, maybe less. Listen to me very carefully. His voice was low, even, the kind of voice that had spent decades being the calmest thing in a room. You are not going to confront him. You are not going to give him any indication that you know anything at all. Can you do that? Yes. Are you safe right now? She thought about that question longer than she expected to. Am I safe? She looked around the bedroom she had shared with a man who had recorded conversations about her becoming a liability and filed them next to documents labeled IB Post-Birth Protocol. For the moment, she said, pack what you need. Documents, medical records, anything your father left you, the drives, if you've made copies. Nothing sentimental except what fits in a single bag. Be ready to leave before he returns. And go where? Here, Gideon said. Come here. She reached into the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the baby blanket she had brought in from the nursery without quite realizing it, holding it against her chest the way you hold something that belongs to the person you are most afraid for. Okay, she said. Isabella. His voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, something more deliberate. Your father structured that trust for exactly this reason. He knew what kind of people you might encounter. He wanted you to have something that couldn't be taken. She stood up in the dark bedroom. She straightened her back. She felt the baby move again, that slow and certain shift, and she pressed the phone harder against her ear. Tell me everything when I get there, she said. She ended the call. She opened the closet and pulled out a bag. Somewhere below, in the underground parking garage, Lucian Blackwood was probably still in his car, still on his phone, still utterly certain that the woman on the 43rd floor was exactly where he had left her, in a kitchen that smelled like rosemary, soft, invisible, and completely unaware. He did not know that Isabella Ashcroft had spent the last 3 hours becoming someone he had never actually met. She packed in less than 20 minutes. Documents first, then medical records, 2 sets, her OB's contact information written on a card and tucked into the front pocket. The encrypted drives wrapped in a sock and buried at the bottom, her father's address book, a change of clothes, her laptop, the baby blanket, half finished, needles still in the yarn, folded carefully on top of everything. She stood at the door of the nursery one more time. The crib she had assembled herself, the mobile she had hung from the ceiling, the small bookshelf she had already started filling with books she intended to read aloud. She looked at it long enough to make sure she remembered it exactly. Then she turned off the light. She took the service elevator, not the private one. She walked through the building's basement corridor with her bag over one shoulder and her hand on her belly, and she came out onto 72nd Street into the cold Thanksgiving air, the city still lit and warm all around her, families behind windows above her, and she walked 2 blocks north before she called a car. She did not look back at the building. The car arrived in 4 minutes. She got in. The driver asked her where she was heading, and she gave him Gideon's address in Hudson, 2 hours north into the dark. The driver didn't say anything else. He pulled out into traffic. Isabella sat in the back seat with her bag at her feet and the baby blanket in her hands and watched Manhattan slide past the window, the lights of the city reflecting off the river as they crossed north. And she thought about one thing and one thing only. Not about Lucien, not about Celeste, not about the recordings or the shell companies or the documents labeled with her initials. She thought about her son, because she knew, with the specific certainty of a woman who has been paying attention to her own body for 6 months, that it was a boy. And she thought about what kind of world she was going to hand him when she was done with all of this. And she decided in the back of that car on Thanksgiving night, moving north through the dark along the Hudson River, that the world she handed him was not going to be the one Lucien Blackwood had designed. It was going to be the one her father had protected, the one she was just beginning to understand she already owned. The car moved north through the dark, and Isabella did not sleep. She had thought she might. The exhaustion was real, the kind that settles into the bones of a pregnant woman who has been standing in a kitchen since 2 in the afternoon and has since dismantled the entire architecture of her life. But sleep didn't come. Her body was too awake. Her hands sat in her lap around the folded baby blanket, and she could feel her own pulse in her fingertips, steady and insistent, like something knocking to be let in. The driver had the radio on low. A jazz station out of the city, the signal starting to break up as they moved further north along the river. She watched the lights of Yonkers slide past, then Terrytown, then nothing but dark trees and the occasional blur of a gas station. The Hudson was out there somewhere to her left, invisible in the November dark, wide and cold and moving. She thought about what she had left behind. Not Lucienne, not the penthouse. She thought about the crib, the mobile she had hung herself, standing on a step stool at 31 weeks, which the pregnancy book said she shouldn't do, but she had done anyway because she wanted to be the one to hang it. Small ceramic birds on thin wire. She had counted them while she worked. 7 birds. She pressed her hand flat against her belly and felt the baby shift in response, slow and deliberate, and she thought, I'm going to have to be very good at this. I don't get to fall apart. She filed that thought away and looked out the window. The GPS on the driver's phone said 47 minutes remaining. She used those 47 minutes to begin making a list in her head. Not a list of grievances, not a list of everything Lucienne had taken or planned to take. She couldn't afford that kind of thinking yet, the thinking that feeds on itself and grows until it crowds out everything useful. Instead, she made a list of what she knew, what she didn't know, and what she needed to find out. Facts arranged in columns, the way her father used to arrange them at the kitchen table in Connecticut. Yellow legal pad, black pen, no wasted motion. What she knew, Lucienne had been with Celeste Rowan for at least 14 months. The financial records she'd photographed showed movement through something called Ashcroft Holdings, her father's name, her legal inheritance, into accounts she didn't recognize. There were documents on his laptop labeled with her initials and the phrase post-birth protocol. He had recorded himself, in his own voice, describing her as a liability. What she didn't know, the legal specifics of the trust her father had left. Whether Lucienne had already moved any assets successfully or whether the transfers were still in progress. Who else was involved? How much time she had? What she needed to find out. Everything Gideon Voss had been holding for her since her father's funeral. She was still running through the list when the car turned off the main road onto a gravel lane that wound between bare November trees, the headlights cutting white tunnels through the dark. The house at the end of the lane was large and old and almost completely dark, except for a single light burning in a ground floor window. Gideon Voss was standing on the porch when the car stopped. He looked exactly as she remembered him, older, grayer, but with the same quality of absolute stillness that she associated with men who had spent decades in rooms where the stakes were very high and the noise was very low. He wore a dark cardigan over a collared shirt, and he was holding a mug in both hands, steam rising, watching her get out of the car with an expression that told her nothing except that he had been expecting her for a long time. She paid the driver. She picked up her bag. She walked up the porch steps, and they looked at each other for a moment in the cold air, and then Gideon said simply, "Come inside." The house was warm, not aggressively heated the way Manhattan apartments were, but genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that comes from old radiators and wood floors and a house that has been lived in for decades. He led her to the kitchen, large, practical, a long table with chairs on both sides, and he set a second mug on the table and gestured for her to sit. She sat. She set her bag on the floor beside her chair and put the baby blanket on the table in front of her, still folded, and she wrapped both hands around the mug. Chamomile. He had already known she wouldn't want coffee. "Tell me what you found," he said, sitting across from her. She told him. All of it, in order, the way she had assembled it in the car. The unlocked phone, the messages, the photographs, the financial records, the voice recordings. She spoke without stopping and without embellishment, and Gideon listened without interrupting, his mug held in both hands, his eyes on her face, and she had the strange sensation of being genuinely listened to for the first time in years. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the old house settling around them. Gideon set his mug down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much do you know about how your father structured the trust?" "Not enough." "No." He looked at her steadily. William knew that. It was one of his few regrets, that he ran out of time to explain it to you properly. He paused. He was going to tell you on your 28th birthday. He had a whole plan. Dinner in Connecticut, the attorneys present, the full briefing. He died 14 months before that. Isabella felt something move through her chest. Not grief exactly, more like the recognition of grief, the outline of it. She had done most of her grieving for her father a long time ago. What she felt now was something more specific, the particular ache of information arriving too late. "Tell me now," she said. Gideon nodded once. The Ashcroft family holdings, the ports, the logistics infrastructure, the majority shares in 3 international freight companies, were never transferred to Blackwood Global. Not legally. What your father did, very carefully, through a series of irrevocable trust instruments executed over 20 years, was establish you as the sole controlling beneficiary of those assets. Lucian Blackwood does not own any of it. He manages it. There is a significant difference. Isabella was quiet for a moment. He manages it under what authority? A management agreement your father's attorneys drafted when you and Lucian married. Gave Lucian operational authority over the business functions, while the underlying ownership remained legally protected under the trust. Your father's intention was to give Lucian room to operate while ensuring the assets could never be transferred, sold, or restructured without your direct consent as the named beneficiary. She thought about the recordings. The assets move in Q1. He's trying to restructure them anyway. He's been trying for 8 months, Gideon said. The transfers I've been monitoring show that he and Celeste have been working with 2 offshore attorneys, one in the Caymans, one in Luxembourg, to build a paper trail that makes it appear the management agreement gives him authority to restructure. It doesn't. The original trust documents are unambiguous. But if he files the restructuring paperwork before anyone challenges it, and if a court accepts the forged interpretation of the management agreement, it could take years to untangle. You've been monitoring this? Yes. She looked at him across the table. For how long? He met her eyes without flinching. Since approximately 6 months after your wedding. The air in the kitchen changed. Not dramatically. Gideon was not a dramatic man, but Isabella felt it shift the way you feel a room change when a window opens somewhere else in a house. 6 months, she said. Yes. And you didn't contact me. He was quiet for a beat. No? She set her mug down carefully. Why? Because at that point what I had was suspicion, not evidence, and because... He stopped. He looked down at his mug and then back up at her, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man holding himself accountable for a decision he'd made in good faith that had still cost someone something. Because your father asked me to give you time to find your own footing. He was very specific about that. He said you needed to come to this on your own terms, or you'd always wonder if you'd been managed. Isabella thought about that for a long moment. He was right, she said finally. I would have wondered. I know. But 6 months is a long time. It is. Gideon didn't offer excuses. She appreciated that. She picked her mug back up. What do we have that's usable? The question seemed to settle something in the room, and Gideon's posture shifted slightly. Not relaxed, but realigned, the way a man shifts when a conversation moves from difficult to operational. The original trust registration documents are in a vault at a law firm in Hartford, your father's firm. They never transferred the files to Lucian's attorneys, which was deliberate. We have certified copies. We have the original management agreement, which clearly limits Lucian's authority. We have 8 months of forensic accounting from a firm I retained independently, showing the unauthorized transfer attempts, the shell company structure, and the offshore accounts. He paused. And now we have what you brought with you tonight. She thought about the 2 drives wrapped in a sock at the bottom of her bag. His own records, she said. His own records, in his own hand, or his own voice. Gideon nodded slowly. That recording you described, where he discusses your post-birth situation, that is not a business document. That is evidence of premeditated intent to defraud and potentially to establish fraudulent grounds for custody action against a competent mother. That changes the nature of what we're dealing with. It was never just a divorce, Isabella said. No, it never was. They sat with that for a moment. Then Gideon said, You need to sleep. We start at 6 tomorrow morning. I have 2 attorneys coming from Hartford and a forensic accountant who has been waiting 18 months for access to the documents you just walked through the door with. Isabella nodded. She stood, slowly, one hand on the table for balance, the automatic accommodation of a body carrying extra weight in new places. She picked up the baby blanket and held it against her for a moment. "Gideon?" She waited until he looked at her. "He described my son as a potential liability." Those were his words. Gideon looked at her steadily. "I know. I need you to understand something." Her voice was level. "I'm not doing this because of the empire. I'm not doing this because of the money or the ports or the trust or anything my father built. I'm doing this because of that." She pressed the blanket lightly against her belly. "So whatever we do, whatever it takes, it has to end with my son having a life that Lucian Blackwood cannot touch." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was always the point, Isabella. Your father understood it. Now you do too." She went to bed at 4:15 in the morning in a room at the top of the stairs that smelled like old wood and clean linen, and she was asleep within minutes, her hand resting flat on her belly, the baby blanket tucked against her side. She did not dream. Her body was done with softness for the night. 6 blocks away from the penthouse, at that exact same hour, Lucian Blackwood stepped out of a town car onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building with the specific expression of a man who expects to find everything exactly where he left it. He rode the private elevator up. He came into the dark penthouse and called her name twice, and the silence that answered him was a different kind of silence than the silence of a sleeping woman. He moved through the rooms quickly, turning on lights, and what he found was a kitchen with a cold oven and a table still set with good china and 2 unburned candles burned halfway down, and beyond that an apartment that contained his possessions, his furniture, his art. But none of her. None of her things. Not the small leather journal she kept by the bed. Not the address book she'd had since her father died. Not the knitting bag from the corner of the nursery. He stood in the nursery doorway for a long time. Then he found his phone on the dining table where he had left it, and he saw the screen was dark and unlocked, and he stood very still for a moment with the phone in his hand, going back through exactly what that meant. He called her. 6 times. Straight to voicemail. He stood in the living room with his coat still on and his phone in his hand, and his face doing something it didn't often do, which was reveal what was underneath it. His jaw was tight. His breathing had changed. Not labored, but shallow, in the way of a man who is running calculations and not liking where they land. He called Celeste. She picked up on the second ring, groggy, the sleep still thick in her voice. "Lucienne, it's 4 in the morning. She's gone." Silence. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, she's not here. Her things are gone. Her documents are gone." A pause. "And I left my phone." The silence on Celeste's end changed quality. He could hear her sitting up. "How long was it unlocked?" "I don't know." "Lucienne." Her voice had sharpened into something much more awake. "Did she have access to the laptop?" He looked toward his office, the laptop he used for the secure files, the restructuring documents, the offshore account records. He walked to the office. He looked at the laptop. He looked at the angle of it on the desk. Not quite the angle he always left it. "She may have had time," he said. "Hours." "Oh, God. Don't." His voice went cold. The kind of cold that cuts. "Don't panic. That's not useful right now." "Don't panic. Lucienne, if she has those files, she doesn't know what she's looking at. She's 28 years old and pregnant, and she's never looked at a balance sheet in her life. She grew up watching William Ashcroft run a billion-dollar shipping operation." Celeste's voice was tight and precise. "Don't underestimate her, because you need to." A long pause. "Where would she go?" he said. "I don't know. A friend? A hotel?" "She doesn't have friends. Not real ones. We made sure of that." He said it flatly, without remorse, the way you state a tactical decision. "Family? Her mother's been dead for years. Father's dead. No siblings." "Father's contacts," Celeste said slowly. "William's people. Who was his Voss?" The word came out of Lucienne like a stone dropping. "Gideon Voss." "Who is that?" "Her father's legal strategist. Retired, or supposedly retired. He was already moving back to the living room, already pulling up contacts on the work phone he kept separate from the personal one Isabella had found. He was at William's funeral. I knew about him. I had him looked into when we first... I should have, Lucy Yen. He stopped. You need to call Marcus. Marcus Hale, his attorney. The one who knew everything, had structured everything, whose name appeared on documents that should not see the inside of a courtroom. It's 4 a.m, Lucy Yen said. I know what time it is, Celeste said. Call him anyway. He called Marcus Hale at 4:22 in the morning, and Marcus picked up because attorneys like Marcus kept phones charged, and by the bed and answered them at any hour when the client paying them what Lucian paid demanded it. She's gone, Lucian said, and she had access to the files. There was a pause on Marcus's end, a professional pause, the pause of a man organizing a rapid response. Then, did she take anything physical? Documents? Unknown. We need to know. I need to know specifically what she may have. Another pause. Lucian, the trust registration copies, the originals that William filed in Hartford. If she has those, or if she has access to them through someone who knows where they are. She doesn't know about Hartford, Lucian said, but even as he said it, the certainty in his voice had a hollow center. She doesn't know. She can't know. He pressed his eyes closed briefly. Voss would know. Then we have a problem, Marcus said, a significant one. The room was very quiet. What do we do? Lucien asked. First thing in the morning, we file a motion citing concern for her well-being. Pregnant woman, disappeared in the night, potentially in an emotionally compromised state. Marcus's voice was even, practiced, the voice of a man who had done ugly things legally and considered it craftsmanship. We establish a paper trail that positions her disappearance as cause for concern. We get ahead of the narrative. And if she comes back with an attorney, then we have a different conversation. But right now she's a pregnant woman who vanished overnight and you're a concerned husband. That's the story. Can you maintain that story? Lucian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the nursery door at the end of the hall, still open, the dark room visible beyond it. The empty crib. The mobile with 7 ceramic birds. Yes, he said. I can maintain it. He ended the call. He stood in the apartment for a long time after that, in the quiet that she had left behind, and for just a moment, a single, unguarded moment that he would never acknowledge to anyone, he felt something that was not anger and not calculation, but something older and rawer, something that lived beneath the architecture of the man he had spent 20 years building. He felt the specific fear of a man who has never been caught before and suddenly understands what being caught means. Then he put the feeling somewhere deep and dark and locked the door on it. He sat down at the dining table at the place setting she had made for him. The good china, the cloth napkin, the small handwritten card he hadn't noticed when he first came home, and he picked up the card and read it. Happy Thanksgiving. Her handwriting, the loops of it, the careful, unhurried loops. He set the card back down. He straightened it against the plate so it sat exactly as she had placed it. Then he called Marcus back. One more thing, he said. The media contacts we have at the Post and at the business desk at the Times. I want a story ready to place. Something about her emotional state, medical concerns, pregnancy complications causing erratic behavior. He paused. I want it ready to go the moment she surfaces publicly. Marcus was quiet for a beat. That's aggressive. She was aggressive first. Understood. A pause. I'll have something drafted by 7. At 6 in the morning in Gideon Voss's kitchen in Hudson, New York, 2 attorneys from Hartford spread certified documents across the long table while a forensic accountant set up a laptop and a portable hard drive. Isabella sat at the head of the table in clothes she had slept in for less than 2 hours, her hair pulled back, a cup of chamomile in her hands, the baby blanket over her knees like a lap blanket. She looked at the documents. She looked at the faces of the people Gideon had assembled, competent, serious, awake at an hour that required commitment, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Ready, not calm. Ready is not calm. Ready is the specific state of a person who is afraid and exhausted and carrying more than their body was designed to carry and has decided that none of that is going to stop them. Ready has edges. Ready keeps its eyes open. The lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Drews, late 50s, silver hair cut short, the kind of face that had sat across from hostile counsel in too many depositions to be rattled by much, set a single document at the center of the table, and looked at Isabella. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "I want to confirm something with you directly. The trust instruments your father filed, the originals in Hartford, establish you as the sole controlling beneficiary of the Ashcroft family holdings. Not a co-beneficiary, not a partial holder. Sole, controlling. Your husband's management authority is specifically and legally subordinate to your beneficial interest, and it is revocable by you at any time." Isabella looked at the document. "He doesn't know that." "He may suspect it," Patricia said, "but he has never had access to the original filing, only to the management agreement, which, and this is deliberate, it was deliberate from the beginning, was written to appear more expansive than it legally is. My father wrote it that way on purpose. Your father and I wrote it that way together." Patricia said it simply, without pride. William understood who he was dealing with. He needed Lucian to feel he had authority in order to keep him visible and manageable. He did not want Lucian to know the ceiling above him until the ceiling needed to come down. The room was quiet. Isabella looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up at Patricia. "How do we bring it down?" Patricia opened a second folder. "We start with a formal revocation of the management agreement. That triggers a mandatory audit of all transactions executed under Lucian's authority for the past 3 years. The shell companies, the offshore transfers, the restructuring attempts, all of it becomes subject to legal review the moment the revocation is filed." "And when can we file?" "We can file today." Patricia met her eyes. "But Isabella, the moment we file, he will know, and he will move fast." "He's already moving," Isabella said. "He called his attorney at 4 a.m. I know Lucien. He doesn't panic. He preempts." She paused. "If we wait, we lose the window. If we file today, we control the timing." Patricia looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Isabella. "File today," Isabella said. Patricia nodded once and reached for her pen. And that was the moment. Not the penthouse, not the phone, not the recordings. That was the moment Isabella Ashcroft crossed a line she could never uncross. Because a woman who copies files from her husband's laptop has options. A woman who disappears in the night can still be painted as unstable. A woman who picks up a phone and calls an old friend can be dismissed as frightened. But a woman who sits at a table at 6 a.m. with her father's attorneys and says, "File today." That woman has made a decision. That woman is not running. That woman is coming. Across the table, the forensic accountant plugged the first encrypted drive into his laptop, and the screen filled with data. And somewhere in Manhattan, Lucian Blackwood was sitting in a penthouse drafting a story about an emotionally unstable wife. And he did not yet know that while he was telling his story, she was already writing the ending to "The drive took 11 seconds to load." Isabella watched the forensic accountant's screen fill with columns of data, account numbers, transfer dates, entity names, transaction amounts, and she felt something settle in her chest that was close to relief. Close to it. Not quite there, because relief requires a margin of safety, and she didn't have one yet, but close enough that she allowed herself to take a full breath for the first time since Thanksgiving night. The accountant's name was Raymond Cho, late 40s, compact, precise in the way of someone who had spent a career finding things that other people believed were permanently hidden. He wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and he put them on now and leaned toward the screen with the focused stillness of a man who speaks the language of numbers, the way other men speak English. Not as a learned skill, but as a first language, the one he thought in. "Give me 20 minutes, he said, without looking up. Patricia Drews was already on her phone at the far end of the table, her voice low, coordinating with the Hartford filing office. The second attorney, a younger man named Whitfield who handled the corporate side, was working through the trust registration documents in physical form, flagging pages with colored tabs. The kitchen smelled like coffee and paper and the specific, focused energy of people doing important work fast. Gideon stood at the kitchen window with his mug, looking out at the back property where the November trees had gone completely bare, their branches black against a gray early morning sky. He had not said much since the attorneys arrived. That was his specific skill. knowing when to be the person who set the table and when to be the person who sat back and let others eat. Isabella sat at the head of the table. She sat straight. Her lower back was doing what it had been doing for weeks, a low, persistent ache, the kind the OB had told her was normal, and she believed was normal, but that felt on mornings like this one less like a symptom of pregnancy, and more like her body's way of noting that it was carrying too much. She kept her hands around her mug. She watched Raymond work. At 6:47, his posture changed. It was a small change, just a degree or two of forward lean, almost imperceptible, the kind of physical adjustment that happens when a person finds something they were looking for, or more significantly, something they were not looking for. He reached out and scrolled slowly, stopped, scrolled back, stopped again. "Cho," she said. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He enlarged a section of the screen and leaned closer, his reading glasses almost touching the monitor. Then he sat back slowly and took the glasses off and looked at her, and she knew from the specific quality of the look. Careful, measuring, the look of a man who is deciding how to deliver something, that the 20 minutes she had expected were already over and the news was different from the news she had been preparing for. "The transfers I've been tracking," he said, "the offshore accounts, the restructuring attempts, those are all here. Those are all real and documented and exactly what we expected." He paused. But there's a second layer. The room had gone quiet. Patricia had ended her call. Whitfield had stopped turning pages. "A second layer," Isabella said. "There's a series of transactions that predate what I was tracking, going back not 8 months, going back 4.5 years. He turned the laptop slightly so she could see the screen. "These aren't restructuring attempts. These are completed transfers, executed and settled. 4.5 years ago." Isabella and Lucien had been married for 3.5 years. She did the math before Raymond finished his sentence and felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the chair she was sitting in. "Before we were married," she said. "Before you were married," Raymond confirmed. "The management agreement your father executed, the one giving Lucien operational authority over the Ashcroft holdings. It was signed 11 months before your wedding, during the engagement." Patricia set her phone on the table. "Raymond, be specific." Raymond looked at her over his glasses. "There are 18 completed asset transfers executed during the 11-month engagement period, before the wedding, before the trust beneficiary protections fully activated for Isabella as a spouse. 17 of those transfers moved capital through the Ashcroft family's legacy freight accounts into a holding entity called Meridian Coastal Partners." He paused. "Meridian Coastal Partners is owned by a blind trust." "Whose blind trust?" Patricia said. "That's what I'm getting to." Raymond turned back to the laptop. "The blind trust has 3 named beneficiaries. One is Lucien Blackwood. One is a financial entity registered in Luxembourg that I haven't fully traced yet." He looked up at Isabella. "The third is a law firm, a domestic law firm. One I recognize." The kitchen was completely silent. "Which firm?" Gideon said from the window. His voice was quiet, quieter than usual. Raymond said the name, and Gideon Voss set his mug down on the windowsill with a small, careful click, and something moved across his face that Isabella had never seen there before in the few hours she had known him. Something that was not composure. Something that cracked the surface of it and showed what was beneath. Not panic, but a very specific kind of devastation. The kind that belongs to a person who is looking at a wound they gave themselves without knowing it. "Gideon," Isabella said. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood at the window for a moment with his back to the room, and the November trees were gray and bare outside, and the silence in the kitchen had a weight to it. Then he turned. "The firm," he said. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of effort. "It was William's firm, your father's firm, the firm I used when I was in practice, the firm I recommended to your father when he needed to structure the trust 20 years ago." "I know which firm it is," Isabella said. "I want to know why it's a beneficiary of a blind trust that has been siphoning assets from my family's holdings since before I married Lucien." Gideon was quiet. "Gideon." Her voice stayed level. It cost her something to keep it level. "How long have you known about Meridian Coastal Partners?" The silence that followed was not long, 3, maybe 4 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that contains more information than most conversations. Isabella watched his face. She was very good at watching faces now. She had been practicing on Lucien for 3 years. I discovered the meridian transfers 6 weeks ago, Gideon said, when Raymond's initial analysis came back. 6 weeks ago, Isabella set her mug down. You've known for 6 weeks that there were completed transfers, not attempted, completed. And you didn't lead with that. I didn't have the full picture. You had enough of a picture. Isabella Bull. Did you know about the law firm connection? Another pause, shorter this time. I suspected. The word landed in the room like something falling from a height. Patricia Drews looked at Gideon with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very cold. Whitfield had stopped pretending to look at documents. Isabella stood up. She did it slowly, one hand on the table, the accommodation for balance that her body required, and the deliberateness of it, the slowness, the control, was more unsettling in that moment than if she had slammed her hands on the table and shouted. She was 28 weeks pregnant, and she had slept 2 hours, and she was standing in a kitchen in Hudson, New York, being told that the betrayal she had spent the night assembling evidence against had a basement she hadn't known existed. Tell me everything, she said. Not what you suspect, not what you partially know. Everything you have, in the order you have it, starting from the beginning. Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, and she noticed that his knuckles were slightly white, and she filed that away. When your father first asked me to consult on the trust structure 20 years ago, he began, there were 3 attorneys involved. I was one. The second was a senior partner at the Hartford firm named Gerald Marsh, who is now retired. The third was a junior associate who worked on the documentary side, the filing, the registration, the creation of the subsidiary entities. Gideon paused. That associate's name was Thomas Wren. He is now a named partner at the same firm. And Thomas Wren is connected to Meridian Coastal Partners, Isabella said. Thomas Wren created Meridian Coastal Partners, Gideon said. I have believed for 6 weeks, but could not confirm, that Wren was approached by Lucien before the engagement, before Lucien ever entered your life publicly. He looked at her steadily. Lucien did not find you by accident, Isabella. He was introduced to you at a function that Wren arranged. The room did not make a sound. Isabella stood very still. She was aware of her own breathing, the specific texture of it, the way it had gone very shallow in a way she recognized now. The same shallowness as the bathtub on Thanksgiving night, the same cold clarity. The charity gala, she said. Yes. Wren arranged the guest list. Wren introduced Lucien to the event organizer. Yes. She thought about the gala. She thought about meeting Lucien, the specific memory of it, the details she had stored with the particular care that people store the origin stories of their great loves, the way he had crossed the room. The first thing he had said to her, something dry and precise about the centerpieces that had made her laugh, and she had been surprised to laugh, 8 months after her father's funeral, surprised that laughter still existed in her body. That moment had been engineered. The laugh had been engineered. She sat back down. Not because her legs gave out, they didn't, but because standing was consuming energy she needed for thinking. How much did Wren take? She said. Raymond answered. Based on what I can trace, the 17 completed transfers plus projected interest on the Meridian holdings. Approximately $63 million. Taken before the wedding, Patricia said flatly. Before the trust beneficiary protections were fully operative for Isabella as a spouse. Technically executed under the management agreement Lucien signed during the engagement. Which Wren drafted, Whitfield said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was young and tight. Which Wren drafted, Patricia confirmed. She looked at Isabella. He wrote the management agreement with specific windows in it, periods during the engagement when asset transfers could be executed under the preliminary operational authority before the spousal protection clauses activated. It was extraordinary careful work. She said it the way you say something that you find repellent but cannot help respecting technically. Someone spent a very long time building this. 4.5 years, Isabella said. At minimum. At minimum, Raymond agreed. She thought about that. 4.5 years. She had been 23 4.5 years ago. She had been in Connecticut, moving through her father's house after his death, sorting his books, signing documents she didn't fully understand because grief had made her mind slow, and the attorneys had told her not to worry, and the attorney she had trusted most was Thomas Wren. "I signed documents with Wren," she said, "after my father died, during the estate process." Gideon's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "I know." "Were any of those documents?" "I don't know yet," he said. "Raymond needs to go through the estate records." "Then that's next," she said. "That's what Raymond does next." Raymond was already pulling up a new window on his laptop. He worked without being asked twice. Isabella pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Just a moment, a single compact gesture of exhaustion, and then dropped her hands and looked at the ceiling and then back at the table. She thought about Lucien. She thought about him in a new way now, or not a new way exactly, but a deeper one, the way you look at a photograph you've studied and then hold it at a different angle and suddenly see the shadow behind the subject that you missed every time before. Lucien had not been an opportunist who found her and saw what she had. He had been a project, a specific, long-planned, carefully resourced project whose target had been the Ashcroft family holdings, and whose primary instrument had been the Ashcroft family's daughter. She was not the wife who discovered the betrayal. She had been the mechanism of it. That distinction mattered. It mattered in a way she did not have language for yet, a way that sat in the center of her chest like a coal, not hot enough to burn, not cold enough to ignore. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Manhattan area code. She answered it because they were past the point of not answering things. Isabella Ashcroft. The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, the specific cadence of a man accustomed to making uncomfortable calls professionally. "My name is Philip Drake. I'm a senior reporter at the New York Post. I was hoping to get a comment from you regarding your current situation." She said nothing. She looked at Gideon across the table. "We're running a piece in the morning edition," Drake continued. "It concerns a source close to your husband who has raised significant concerns about your mental and emotional state during your pregnancy. The source describes a pattern of erratic behavior and raises questions about your capacity to manage the business responsibilities you've recently been attempting to assume." A pause. "There's also a mention of your unannounced departure from the family residence last night, which the source describes as alarming." "Who is the source?" she said. "I'm not able to—" "But is the source Marcus Hale?" A pause. Not a confirming pause, but not a denying one either. "Mrs. Blackwood, we're giving you the opportunity to—" "I'm going to need the name of your editor," she said, "and I'm going to need the piece held for 24 hours. What I have to tell you is going to substantially change what you print." "Ma'am, we have a publication?" "Mr. Drake." Her voice did not rise. "In approximately 4 hours, I'm going to be filing documents in Connecticut that will redefine the ownership structure of Blackwood Global and initiate a criminal fraud investigation. I have recordings, financial records, and certified trust documents. If you run a piece today describing me as emotionally unstable, you will be running that piece on the morning of one of the largest corporate fraud exposures in this company's history, and your byline will be attached to a story that actively sided with the perpetrator." She paused. "Hold the piece. Call me back in 4 hours. That's my comment." She ended the call. The kitchen was quiet again. Patricia Drews looked at her with an expression that had moved past professional into something more personal. "That was well handled." "It wasn't handling," Isabella said. "It was the truth." She looked at the table, at the documents and the laptops and the colored tabs and the faces of the people her father had, in some long-ago careful way, arranged to be in this room with her at this exact moment. He's already running the media play, which means he knows we're moving, which means someone told him. The room absorbed that. "The Hartford filing," Patricia said slowly. "Is the filing office secure?" Isabella looked at Patricia directly. "It should be. My contact there is someone I've worked with for 15 years. "Should be is not is," Isabella said. "Who else knew we were filing today?" "The 4 people in this room," Patricia said, "and Whitfield's paralegal, who prepared the documents overnight." "And Thomas Wren," Raymond said quietly from behind his laptop. Everyone looked at him. He turned the screen so they could see it. "Because Thomas Wren's firm is listed as a notification party on the original trust registration. Any formal legal action touching the trust triggers an automatic notification to all named parties." He paused. "Wren would have been notified the moment Patricia initiated the filing process this morning. Automatically. By the system your father built. The silence that followed had a different quality than all the previous silences. This one had edges. He knew the moment we started, Gideon said. He knew before we finished our coffee, Raymond said. Isabella looked at Gideon. Can we pull the filing back? Patricia shook her head. It's already in the system. Pulling it back would require... It would signal weakness, Gideon said, and it would give them time to counterfile with the forged management agreement interpretation before we can establish our position. So we can't go forward and we can't go back, Whitfield said. He sounded young. We can go forward, Isabella said. We just have to accept that we're doing it without the element of surprise. She looked at Raymond. How long to complete the trace on the estate documents? The ones I signed after my father died? If Wren was careful, days. If he got lazy, and people who get away with things for 4 years often get lazy, maybe 6 hours. You have 6 hours, she said. Patricia, is there any way to accelerate the board notification? If we can get a copy of the revocation filing and the trust ownership evidence to Blackwood Global's board before Lucien gets to them. Lucien controls board communications, Patricia said. Then we go around him. We go directly to individual board members. Do we have names? 7 directors, Whitfield said. He was already on his laptop. I have 3 of them with independent legal representation who we could contact directly without going through Blackwood Global channels. Contact all 3, she said. Today. Before noon. Patricia looked at Gideon again. That look between 2 people who have known each other long enough to communicate without speaking. And what passed between them was something that resembled reassessment. The reassessment of a person who thought they understood the situation and is finding that the situation is ahead of them. Then Isabella's phone buzzed on the table. Not a call this time. A text. From Lucien's personal number. The one she had avoided looking at all morning. She picked it up. She read it. Whatever you think you found, you don't understand what you're looking at. You're going to hurt yourself and our son. Come home and we talk. That's all I'm asking. Just come home. She read it twice. She was aware of the particular skill of it, the specific calibration of it, the way it moved between threat and tenderness in a single paragraph, the way it invoked the baby, the way it positioned her as someone who doesn't understand rather than someone who has caught him. It was very good. She could see, clearly now, how it had worked on her for 3 years, the way he always made her feel slightly less capable than the situation required, slightly behind, slightly in need of the translation only he could provide. You don't understand what you're looking at. She set the phone face down on the table. Then Raymond said, Isabella. His voice had changed. The flat professional tone had dropped about 2 registers into something she hadn't heard from him yet. She looked at him. His face behind the reading glasses was doing something careful. The estate documents, he said. I found something. Already? He wasn't careful. Raymond turned the laptop. After your father died, during the estate process, there was a document signed releasing a specific set of physical assets from the trust protection, port licenses. 3 of them. The original port operation licenses your grandfather filed when he built the first Ashcroft terminal in 1987. He looked at her. Without those licenses, the ports are operating under legacy grandfather provisions that can be challenged. If the licenses are not legally held by the trust beneficiary, the port operations are vulnerable to a hostile licensing claim. She stared at the screen. I signed that release. Your signature is on the document. Yes. I was 22. I was 8 months past my father's funeral, and I signed whatever Wren put in front of me because he told me it was administrative cleanup. She stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Can we reverse it? Raymond took his glasses off. That depends on whether the signature was obtained under fraudulent misrepresentation. If we can demonstrate that you were not told the true nature of what you signed, I was not told the true nature of what I signed. Then it's a challenge, not a certainty, Raymond said. If Lucien's attorneys get to a sympathetic judge with the license documents before we establish the fraud case, they'll file for an emergency injunction, Patricia said. They'll claim the licenses are legitimately transferred and seek to freeze any challenge to the port operations pending review. She looked at the ceiling briefly. That could take months, years. And during those months, Isabella said, Lucien continues to operate the ports under the transferred licenses. With Meridian Coastal Partners as the beneficiary, Raymond said, with Thomas Wren as the named partner. With 63 million already moved and more to follow, and a carefully prepared story about an emotionally unstable pregnant wife who abandoned the family home and now wanted to dismantle an empire she didn't understand. Isabella sat in the kitchen of Gideon Voss's house in Hudson, New York, on the morning after Thanksgiving, 28 weeks pregnant, running on 2 hours of sleep and chamomile tea. And she understood with complete, cold, absolute clarity that the plan she had walked in with, file the revocation, present the evidence, let the legal process do its work, was not going to be enough. The legal process moved slowly. Lucienne moved fast. Wren had a 4-year head start and a document bearing her 22-year-old signature and a media contact who was already writing a story about her mental state. She looked at Gideon. "The board meeting," she said. He frowned slightly. "There's no board meeting scheduled until—" "There will be," she said. "We're going to call one." She looked at Patricia. "What does it take to call an emergency board meeting at Blackwood Global?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, working through it. "Any board member can request an emergency session with 48 hours' notice if they can demonstrate a material concern about the company's legal exposure." She paused. "If we can get one of the 3 independent directors to make that request, today," Isabella said, "before Lucienne gets to them. If we reach them first, we reach them first." She looked at Whitfield. "Make the calls, now. Don't wait for noon." Then she looked at Raymond. "The license documents, the ones with my signature. I need to know if there are any procedural defects in the way they were filed, any technical flaw that could be used to challenge their validity, independent of the fraud argument." "I'll look," Raymond said. "And Gideon?" She looked at him last. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment, and she thought about what he had and hadn't told her, and she thought about 6 weeks, and she thought about how trust is not a thing you restore in a morning, but is sometimes a thing you table because you don't have time for it right now. "The board meeting," she said. "When we walk in, and we are walking in, I need you standing next to me. Not behind me, next to me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her phone. She turned it face up and looked at Lucienne's message one more time. "Come home and we talk." And she typed back 4 words, quickly, without deliberation. "See you at the board." She set the phone down. She reached for the baby blanket on the back of her chair and laid it across her lap, and she felt the baby move. That slow and deliberate shift that had become the most reliable thing in her life over the past 6 months. And she pressed her hand flat against her belly, just for a moment, just for one. She sent the text at 7:14 in the morning. By 7:16, Lucienne had read it. She knew because the read receipt appeared on her screen, a small gray check mark that contained, in its smallness, everything she needed to know about where the next 48 hours were going. He read it. He did not respond. Which meant he was already on another call, already moving, already deploying the specific machinery of a man who had spent his entire adult life turning other people's reactions into his advantage. She put the phone in her bag and looked at Whitfield. "Make the calls." He was already dialing. The next 4 hours in Gideon's kitchen were the most concentrated work Isabella had ever done. Not the most dramatic. There would be more dramatic hours ahead. She understood that with the cold certainty of someone who could see the shape of the thing approaching. But the most concentrated. The kind of work where every minute has a cost, and every decision forecloses 3 others, and the only sustainable mental state is a complete and ruthless focus on the next necessary thing. Whitfield reached 2 of the 3 independent directors by 9. The third didn't answer and called back at 9:40, with a lawyer of his own on the line, which Patricia handled in a voice that was serene in the way of someone who has been in worse rooms and won. By 10:15, they had enough. Director Anita Breslow, a 60-year-old former federal prosecutor who sat on Blackwood Global's board in an independent governance capacity and who, Raymond established in 12 minutes of background research, had never once voted with Lucienne on a compensation committee question, agreed to formally request an emergency board session. "She'll file the request at noon," Patricia said, coming off the call. 48 hours from that is noon on Saturday. "Lucienne will fight the session," Gideon said. "He can't. The bylaws are clear. Any independent director can call an emergency session if they cite material legal exposure. He can object, but he can't block." Patricia set her phone on the table. What he can do is spend the next 48 hours doing what he's already doing, moving assets, preparing alternative documentation, and building the media narrative. He's had 3 hours, Isabella said. How much damage can he do in 3 hours? Raymond looked up from his screen. More than you'd want. At 11:20, Isabella's phone showed a news alert. She saw it before anyone else because she was looking at her phone when it came through, and for a moment she just sat very still and read the headline, and then she turned the phone and showed it to the room. Blackwood heir apparent. Sources close to shipping magnate Lucian Blackwood raise alarm over wife's sudden disappearance amid pregnancy concerns. Mental health professionals weigh in. The piece was not in the Post. It was on a financial news site, one of the aggressive second-tier outlets that moved faster than newspapers and asked fewer questions about sourcing. The byline was not Philip Drake. Lucien had fed it to someone else entirely, someone who hadn't called for comment first. Patricia read it on her own phone. Her face did not change. It's thin. Unnamed sources, no specifics. Any competent attorney challenges this in a morning. It doesn't have to be accurate, Isabella said. It just has to exist. She set her phone face down. If I walk into that boardroom and 3 directors have already read a story describing me as mentally unstable, I'm walking in behind it. Then we counter it, Patricia said. How? You give an interview. The room was quiet for a beat. Now? Gideon said. Now, today, before it compounds. Patricia looked at Isabella directly. You are 28 weeks pregnant. You are composed, and you have evidence. Let someone see that. Isabella thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. Not because she was uncertain, but because 10 seconds of thinking was what the question deserved. Then she said, Philip Drake. The Post reporter who called me this morning. He held the piece when I asked. That's a man who at least wanted the story to be real. He wanted the bigger story, Gideon said. Then give him it. She picked up her phone and found Drake's number in her recent calls. But we control what he sees and when he sees it. Nothing about the board meeting until after we walk in. Nothing about Wren until we're ready to file the fraud complaint. She looked at Patricia. What can I tell him today that is accurate, verifiable, and does not compromise the legal position? Patricia thought for a moment. The trust ownership, the basic structure, that you are the legal beneficiary of the Ashcroft holdings, and that Lucian's authority is managerial, not ownership. That's public record once the revocation files. She paused. And the existence of the recordings. Not the content, just the existence. That's enough, Isabella said. She called Drake. He picked up in one ring. Mrs. Blackwood. I told you 4 hours. It's been 4 hours. She stood up from the table and moved to the far end of the kitchen, near the window where Gideon had stood earlier. I have something for you. Not everything. Not yet. But enough for you to understand what the story actually is. She talked for 22 minutes. She was precise, and she was measured, and she did not raise her voice once, and she did not offer anything she and Patricia had not already cleared. When she was done, Drake was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to verify the trust documentation, he said. Patricia Drews Hartford. She'll confirm the public record elements today. She paused. Mr. Drake, the piece that went up this morning on the financial site, whoever gave that to them is the same person who is committing fraud against a family trust. That's the story you want to be ahead of, not behind. Another pause. I'll hold what I have until I can verify. That's all I'm asking. She ended the call and stood at the window for a moment with her phone in her hand, looking out at the same bare November trees Gideon had been looking at all morning, and she felt the baby move, harder than usual, a sharp elbow or knee, some small person inside her registering the tension of the morning in the only way available. And she pressed her hand flat against her side and breathed. One thing at a time. One thing at a time. At 12:45, Anita Breslow filed the emergency board session request. At 12:47, Marcus Hale called Patricia and told her the request was procedurally invalid. At 12:48, Patricia told Marcus Hale exactly which subsection of the Blackwood Global Corporate Bylaws authorized the request and suggested he reread his own client's governing documents before making another call. Marcus Hale did not call back. The afternoon passed in the specific relentless way of afternoons that contain too much. Raymond worked through the estate documents and found 3 additional procedural defects in the port license transfer. Small things, technical things, the kind of errors that a careful attorney reviewing for the first time might miss, but that a forensic accountant trained to find exactly this kind of buried mistake would not. Not enough to invalidate the transfer on their own. Enough to slow any injunction attempt. Isabella ate something at 2 o'clock because Gideon put a plate in front of her and looked at her in a way that reminded her, with a specific and unexpectedly sharp pain, of her father putting plates in front of her during long work sessions in the Connecticut kitchen, and she ate without tasting it and kept reading documents. By 4 in the afternoon, she had read more legal text in one day than in her entire previous life combined. Her eyes ached. Her back had progressed from persistent to insistent. She was running on the specific fuel of people who cannot afford to stop. Not adrenaline, which burns fast and crashes hard, but something colder and more sustainable. Some metabolic determination that the body produces when the mind refuses to offer it an alternative. At 4:30, her phone rang. Not Lucian's number, not Marcus Hale, not a reporter, a number she didn't recognize. Connecticut area code. She answered it. Isabella. A man's voice, older. Careful in the way of someone choosing words like a person chooses footing on unsteady ground. This is Thomas Wren. She did not move. She stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, and she became aware of her own hand tightening around the phone, the pressure of it, and she deliberately relaxed her grip finger by finger. Mr. Wren, she said. I think it would be beneficial for us to speak directly, he said, before the situation develops further. I agree, she said. Go ahead. A pause. He had expected her to push back. She could hear the recalibration in the silence. What happened 4 years ago? The estate transfers, the meridian structure, those decisions were made within the parameters of what your father's original trust allowed. I understand they look different in hindsight, but I want to assure you, Mr. Wren, her voice was even. You engineered a meeting between me and the man who spent 4 years systematically looting my family's assets. You drafted a document for me to sign when I was 22 years old and 8 months past my father's death that transferred port licenses I did not understand I held. And you structured the Meridian Coastal Partners entity specifically to receive those assets in a manner that obscured your own involvement. She paused. Tell me which part of that I'm looking at incorrectly. Silence. How much does he have on you? She said. The silence changed quality. Because a man in your position, she continued, a named partner at a firm your clients trust, doesn't do what you did for ambition alone. There has to be something he holds over you, something that made the risk worth taking. She waited. I'm not asking to help you, Mr. Wren. I'm asking because it's a variable I need to understand. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, the meridian structure predates Lucian. She went still. Your father's trust, Wren said. The original structure, 20 years ago. His voice had lost whatever preparation it arrived with. He sounded old. He sounded like a man who has been carrying something too long and can feel where it is worn through. When William asked me to set up the subsidiary entities, there were transfers I made, before your father understood the full structure, before he could review everything. A pause. William found out 7 years later. He didn't go to the Bar Association, he didn't go to prosecutors. He came to me privately, and he told me I would spend the rest of my career making it right, or he would end my career and my freedom simultaneously. Isabella stood in the hallway with the phone against her ear. Your father owned me, Wren said. And when he died, Lucien found the files William kept on me. And Lucien owned me instead. The words arrived without drama. That was the worst part of it. The flatness of them, the way something enormous and sickening could be delivered in the voice of an exhausted man in the language of simple facts. You didn't steal from my father because Lucien made you, she said. You were already a thief. Lucien just found the receipt. Wren said nothing. Why are you calling me? Because... He stopped, started again. Because Lucien told Marcus Hale this morning that if the board meeting proceeds and the evidence you have becomes part of the public record, every attorney involved in the Meridian structure gets named in the criminal complaint, including me. And Marcus told me, he called me an hour ago, that Lucien is prepared to offer me up specifically in exchange for a negotiated settlement with prosecutors. Another pause. He's going to sacrifice me to protect himself. And you're surprised, she said. He stopped. No, I'm not surprised. What do you want, Mr. Wren? I want to give you the port license documents, the originals, not the copies in the filing system, the originals, with the actual signature sequence, which will show that the notarization on the page you signed was backdated. He said it fast, the way people say things they have been deciding whether to say. If the notarization is backdated, the transfer is procedurally invalid on its face. You don't need the fraud argument. The transfer is simply void. Isabella pressed her free hand flat against the wall beside her. She felt the plaster, cool and solid, against her palm. "Where are the originals?" she said. "My office. Hartford." He paused. "I can have them couriered to your attorney today, before 5. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Patricia Drews will provide you with the delivery address. You call her directly, not me, within the next 20 minutes. If the documents are not in motion by 5 o'clock, I assume you changed your mind, and I proceed without them." "Understood." "And Mr. Wren." She waited until she heard him waiting. "When this is over, and it will be over, you are still going to face consequences for what you did. I am not in the business of protecting the people who helped build this. I'm telling you that now so you understand what you're choosing." A long pause. "I understand," he said. She ended the call and stood in the hallway alone for a moment, her hand still flat against the wall, feeling her own pulse in her palm. Then she walked back into the kitchen. Everyone looked at her. She told them. Raymond immediately began pulling up the notarization records. Patricia called her office and gave them the delivery address. Gideon stood at the window again and looked at the trees, and she had the sense that he was doing what he always did, which was finding the still point of a very fast-moving thing. The documents arrived at 4:58. Raymond had the notarization discrepancy confirmed by 5:43. The notary seal on the port license transfer bore a date 3 days before Isabella had signed the document. The signature had been collected first, from a 22-year-old woman who was told it was administrative cleanup, and the notarization had been backdated to make the document appear properly witnessed in sequence. "It's void," Raymond said. He said it quietly, with the specific quiet of a man who has just watched months of work resolve into a single clean fact. "The transfer is procedurally void. The licenses never legally moved." "Which means the ports are still in the trust," Patricia said. "Which means Lucien is operating 3 major port facilities under licenses that legally belong to Isabella," Whitfield said. "Which means," Gideon said from the window, turning around, "that every day he continues to operate those ports, he is committing ongoing fraud under federal maritime law." The room absorbed that. Isabella sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her and felt the specific weight of a moment that will not exist again, the moment just before a thing that cannot be undone. She thought about the 48 hours ahead, the board meeting, the boardroom, Lucien on the other side of a table, the way he had been on the other side of tables and beds and silences for 3 years, certain of his own position in the architecture of the world. She thought about what it would take to walk into that room. She thought about her son, who would be born in approximately 12 weeks into whatever world she built or failed to build in the next 2 days. She stood up. "Patricia," she said, "I want the fraud complaint drafted tonight. All of it. The Meridian transfers, the forged documents, the backdated notarization, the recordings. Everything Raymond has and everything Wren just gave us. I want it ready to file simultaneously with our entrance to the board meeting." "That's," Patricia started. "Can it be done?" Patricia looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his laptop. "If we work through the night," he said. "Then we work through the night," Isabella said. She looked at Gideon. "I need a car to Manhattan in the morning, something that doesn't attract attention." He nodded once. "And I need something to wear." She looked down at herself. The clothes she had been in for 20 hours, the maternity jeans and the sweater she had grabbed in the dark. "I need to look like someone who owns what she's walking in to claim." Gideon almost smiled. "I'll call someone." She sat back down. She reached for the baby blanket and pressed it briefly against her chest and then folded it and set it at the corner of the table where she could see it. Then she opened the nearest folder and began to read. She read for 5 hours. She asked questions. She read the answers. She asked more questions. By midnight, she understood the Blackwood global corporate structure better than she had understood her own marriage. And by 2 in the morning, she understood it better than most of the board members who would be sitting across from her in approximately 10 hours. At 2:40, a text came from an unknown number. No message, just a photograph. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. It had been taken outside, night, urban, the quality of a security camera or a phone camera without flash. It showed the entrance of Gideon's Hudson house, taken from somewhere beyond the property line. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. Someone had been watching the house. She brought the phone to Gideon, who was at the kitchen counter with his fourth cup of tea, looking through a binder of legal precedents. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the timestamp. He set down his mug. "How many people know you're here?" he asked. "You, the attorneys, Raymond." She paused. "And whoever Wren told." "You think Wren told him?" "I think a man who spent 20 years being owned by other people has a reflex for giving away addresses," she said. "Even when he thinks he's switching sides." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" She looked at the photograph again. The dark entrance, the timestamp, the fact of being watched in the dark. "Yes," she said, simply, without elaboration. Because she was tired enough that the performance of not being afraid was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Good," Gideon said. "Afraid is appropriate. Afraid means you understand the stakes." He picked up his mug. "It means you're still thinking clearly." She went back to the table. She read for 2 more hours. At 5 in the morning, Patricia set the completed fraud complaint on the table in front of her. 87 pages, tabbed, indexed, every exhibit labeled. The kind of document that takes years to understand and one night to build when the right people are in the room and the stakes are absolute. Isabella picked it up. She held the weight of it in both hands for a moment. She thought about Lucian reading her text. "See you at the board." She thought about his face when she walked in. The specific moment when a man who has spent years building a story encounters the person who has read the whole thing and written the last chapter without him. She set the complaint back down. She looked at Patricia. "What time do we leave?" 7, Patricia said. "The meeting is at 10. We want to be there at 9:30. "Then I have 2 hours." She looked at the table, at the documents and the empty mugs and the laptop screen still running Raymond's analysis in the background. "Somebody please find me a place to sleep for 2 hours that isn't a chair." Gideon showed her to the same room she'd slept in before, the one with the old wood smell and the clean linen. She lay down on top of the covers in the dark and pressed her hand flat against her belly and felt the baby still and quiet, in the way he was quiet in the early morning hours, both of them resting. She thought about the boardroom. She thought about the table, the chairs, the faces she was going to have to hold herself against. She thought about what it costs a person to walk into a room carrying the truth when the room has been arranged against them. She thought about her father, not in any soft or sentimental way. She was too tired for softness. She thought about him the way you think about the person who gave you the tools you're currently using. She thought about what he had built, quietly, over 20 years, knowing that someone would try to take it, knowing that the someone might be the man his daughter married, building the ceiling that Lucian didn't know existed until it came down. The people who want your love and your empire at the same time will always pretend one of them doesn't exist. He had known. She had thought it was advice. It was armor. She closed her eyes. Sleep came in minutes, the deep, sudden sleep of a body that has hit its absolute limit and simply stops. And in the 2 hours before the alarm, she did not dream, and she did not stir, and her hand stayed flat against her belly the whole time, the most instinctive and continuous gesture of everything she was fighting for. At 7 in the morning, a black car pulled up to the front of Gideon's house. Isabella came out the front door in a deep navy maternity suit that Gideon had sourced at midnight from a women's formal retailer in Albany, tailored, severe, the kind of garment that does not apologize for the body wearing it. Her hair was back. She carried the bag she had packed in the dark on Thanksgiving night, and she carried the 87-page fraud complaint in a leather document folder that Patricia held until Isabella reached for it at the car door and took it herself. She got in. Gideon got in beside her. Patricia and Whitfield followed in a second car. The driver pulled out onto the road. Hudson fell away behind them. The sun was up, barely, gray and cold, the kind of November morning that doesn't promise warmth. And the Hudson River appeared beyond the trees as they came down toward the main road, wide and moving and indifferent and very beautiful. She held the document folder in her lap. She did not look at her phone. She looked at the river. 40 miles south, in the 43rd floor penthouse above Manhattan, Lucian Blackwood was standing in front of the mirror in the master bathroom in a white dress shirt, buttoning his cuffs, and he was looking at his own face with the specific expression of a man conducting an internal assessment. He had not slept. There were shadows under his eyes that his face, which was accustomed to concealing things, could not entirely conceal. He had spent the night on calls. Marcus Hale, 2 board members he had already reached, the Luxembourg attorneys, a contact in the financial press. He had moved 3 things he needed to move. He had prepared the counterargument, the alternative narrative, the version of events that positioned him as the wronged party in a marriage to a woman in crisis. He was ready. He looked at himself in the mirror, and he straightened his cuffs, and he told himself he was ready. What he did not know, what Ren had not told him, because Ren had made his choice the previous afternoon, and Lucien had not yet understood the full consequences of that choice, was that the port license transfers were void, that the documents he had built an entire restructuring strategy around had a defect that unmade them entirely. He did not know that Isabella had spent the night in a room 2 hours north reading 87 pages of evidence that included his own voice. He did not know that Anita Breslow had already sent the board meeting notice to all 7 directors. He buttoned his second cuff. He picked up his jacket. He was ready. He was certain he was ready. And downstairs in the lobby of the building, at exactly that moment, the morning security guard was recording the license plate of a black car that had pulled up across the street and was idling in the cold, its occupants invisible behind tinted glass, waiting with the specific patience of people who have nowhere to be until 10 o'clock and know exactly what happens. The car did not move until 9:15. Isabella sat in the back seat for 2 hours and 10 minutes in the cold of that November morning, and she did not fidget, and she did not check her phone more than twice, and she did not speak except once, at 8:40, when she turned to Gideon and said, "Tell me something my father said that you never told me." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside the tinted windows, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always does in the early morning, moving, indifferent, the city's enormous appetite for its own continuation, entirely uninterested in the specific human dramas playing out at street level. "He said," Gideon began, and then stopped, and began again with the care of a man retrieving something he has kept in a specific place for a long time. "He said that the hardest part of building something real is that you have to be willing to watch it get damaged without flinching, because the moment you flinch, the moment you move to protect the thing instead of protecting the principle behind the thing, you've already lost both." Isabella looked out the window. "He was talking about the trust," she said. "He was talking about you," Gideon said. "He knew someone would come for what he'd built. He was less certain whether you'd understand that the trust was never about the ports or the money. It was about giving you something no one could take, not the assets, but the legal standing to defend yourself. The standing was the gift. Everything else was just the occasion." She thought about that for a long time, watching the city move. At 9:15, she said, "Let's go." The driver pulled into traffic. The Blackwood Global headquarters occupied the top 12 floors of a 50-story tower on 6th Avenue, glass and steel, the architecture of certainty, the kind of building designed to communicate that the people inside it had already won. Isabella had been in this building dozens of times. She had attended galas in its lobby, dinners in its executive dining room, a product launch where Lucien had stood at a podium and spoken about legacy, and she had sat in the front row believing every word. She did not look at the building the way she used to look at it. The lobby security knew her. The guard at the main desk, a heavyset man named Carl who had given her a bottle of water once when she arrived overheated from the summer street, looked at her with an expression that moved through recognition into something more complicated, something that knew too much about the morning's context to be simple. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Ms. Ashcroft," she said, quietly. Not as a correction offered in anger, just a fact. Stated at the moment, it became the operative fact. Carl looked at the document folder under her arm. He looked at Patricia and Whitfield and Gideon behind her. He nodded once and said nothing and pressed the button for the executive elevator. The elevator opened on the 38th floor at 9:32. The boardroom was at the end of the main corridor, a long walk, deliberately long, the kind of architectural choice that makes people feel the distance between where they are and where power is formally exercised. Isabella walked it at the pace she had set for herself in the lobby. Not fast, not slow. The pace of someone who is not performing confidence, but simply has enough of it that performance is unnecessary. She was aware of eyes. The executive assistants at their stations, the junior staff moving between offices, People pausing, people watching, people making the rapid calculation that humans make when they sense that something significant is happening in a room they are adjacent to. She did not look at any of them directly. She looked at the end of the corridor. The boardroom doors were closed. Patricia pushed them open. The room was already full. 7 directors arranged around the oval table that dominated the space. Anita Breslow at the far end, compact, silver-haired, with the expression of a woman who has been in rooms like this for 30 years and has stopped being impressed by them. 2 other independent directors whose names Isabella now knew as well as her own. 4 others whose alignment she was less certain of. A stenographer at a small desk to the side. 3 attorneys she didn't recognize, grouped together near the windows. Lucien's legal team, present and prepared. And Lucien. He was at the near end of the table, in the chair that was understood to be his. Not because it was labeled, but because the room arranged itself around it the way rooms arrange themselves around a habit. He was in a dark suit, his cuffs straight, his face composed in the specific way that she now understood was not composure at all, but rather its structural imitation, the external architecture of a man maintaining something inside him by force of will. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back at him. This is the moment that Isabella Ashcroft would think about for years, in the quiet spaces of what came after. Not the documents, not the testimony, not the vote at the end. This moment. The moment of looking. 3 years of marriage across a boardroom table, and what passed between them was not hatred, and not grief, and not love, and not triumph. It was recognition, the specific, terrible recognition of 2 people who have finally stopped pretending to see something that isn't there. She sat down. She set the document folder on the table. She folded her hands on top of it. Marcus Hale was the first to speak, from his position behind Lucien's left shoulder. Before we begin, I'd like to raise a procedural objection to the participation of any party whose legal standing in this company remains. Ms. Ashcroft is the sole controlling beneficiary of the Ashcroft Family Trust, Patricia said, cutting across him with the clean precision of a woman who had prepared for exactly this objection at exactly this moment. Which is the majority stakeholder of Blackwood Global. Her legal standing in this room supersedes every other party present, including the current executive chair. I'll provide the certified trust documentation to the stenographer now. She nodded to Whitfield, who stood and walked a bound copy of the documents to the stenographer without hurry. Marcus Hale opened his mouth. "Mr. Hale," Anita Breslow said from the far end of the table. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "You'll have your opportunity. Let the documentation enter the record first." Marcus Hale closed his mouth. What followed was not dramatic in the way that people expect legal proceedings to be dramatic. There were no outbursts in the first 40 minutes. There was documentation, presented methodically and received in the specific silence of people who are understanding something for the first time. Patricia presented the trust instruments. Raymond, appearing via video on the screen built into the far wall, walked through the financial analysis, the Meridian transfers, the offshore accounts, the shell company structure, with the flat patience of a man describing arithmetic rather than catastrophe. Isabella watched the directors' faces. This was what she had been preparing for without knowing she was preparing for it. This specific skill, reading rooms, reading the small muscular adjustments that faces make when information lands. She watched the moment when each director understood what they were looking at. The moment was slightly different for each of them. For some, it came during Raymond's presentation of the offshore transfers. For one man, a director named Hargrove, who she had always understood to be Lucien's closest ally on the board, it came during the presentation of the port license analysis, when Whitfield projected the backdated notarization on the room's main screen and the numbers spoke for themselves. Hargrove looked at Lucien. Lucien was looking at the screen. He had known they had evidence. He had not known about the notarization defect. She watched him understand it, watched the specific moment when a man who has been managing his own exposure realizes that his exposure is larger than he calculated. His face did not change dramatically. His jaw tightened. That was all. A degree of tightening that she had seen hundreds of times across dinner tables, and she had always read as stress about work, and now understood to be the external pressure of a man holding a very large internal structure in place by will alone. Then Patricia said, "I'd like to play an audio recording. It is time-stamped and authenticated." She looked at the room. "I want to advise anyone present that the content of this recording is direct and explicit." Lucian's hand moved, just slightly, a small, involuntary shift on the table surface, not quite a flinch, but the cousin of one. "Objection," Marcus Hale said. "The provenance of the recording—" "The recording was recovered from a secure device," Patricia said. "It was not intercepted. It was found. The distinction is legally significant." She looked at Anita Breslow. "Director Breslow, the board's authorization to proceed?" Breslow looked around the table. "Any objections from board members?" She looked specifically at the 4 directors whose alignment Isabella was uncertain of. 2 of them were looking at the documents in front of them. 1 was looking at the window. 1, a younger man who had joined the board 2 years ago and who Isabella now knew had been appointed at Lucian's personal recommendation, looked at Lucian. Lucian gave him nothing. "Proceed," Breslow said. Patricia played the recording. Lucian's voice filled the boardroom. Low, precise, unhurried. The voice of a man who has never been asked to account for his calm. Every word exactly as Isabella had heard it sitting on the edge of a bathtub on Thanksgiving night, except that now it was not just her hearing it. It was 7 directors and a stenographer and 3 attorneys for the opposing side, and Gideon Voss standing against the wall with his arms folded and his face doing nothing at all. "After the baby's born, we need to move fast. She's not equipped, Celeste. I'll make sure the record reflects that. Postpartum. Emotional instability. It's not difficult to document. The assets move in Q1. By the time she understands what happened, it'll be restructured beyond recovery. She doesn't know what she holds. She's a liability after the birth. The child too, eventually, if she gets in the way." The recording ended. The boardroom was completely silent for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. The director who had been looking at Lucian looked away. Marcus Hale said, "The recording is taken out of context. Mr. Hale." Isabella spoke for the first time since entering the room. Her voice was not raised. She had been saving it for exactly this, and she used it with the specific economy of someone who understands that the weight of a thing is not in its volume. There is no context in which a man describing his unborn child as a potential liability requires additional explanation. The room held. Lucian looked at her. She looked back at him. She let him look. She owed him that. Not as mercy, but as honesty. She let him see her face without the management she had put on it for 3 years, without the softness she had maintained and the deference she had performed and the faith she had genuinely, completely had in him. She let him see what was actually there now, underneath all of that, which was not hatred and was not satisfaction. It was something quieter and more final. It was the face of a person who has understood something completely and cannot ununderstand it. He looked away first. Anita Breslow called for the vote at 11:47. The motion was to suspend Lucian Blackwood from all executive authority pending an independent investigation into the financial irregularities, the legal validity of the management agreement, and the authenticity of all asset transfer documentation executed under his authority. The motion also authorized the board to engage independent legal counsel to work with the Ashcroft Trust attorneys in reviewing the company's full ownership structure. 6 votes in favor. 1 abstention. Hargrove, who could not bring himself to vote against the man who had given him his board seat, but could not, in the face of everything, vote to protect him. 0 votes against. Marcus Hale stood immediately and began speaking about appeal procedures and shareholder notifications and the market implications of a publicly announced suspension. Patricia listened to him with the expression of a person listening to weather they have already dressed for. And when he finished, she told him quietly and specifically and with great precision why each of his procedural objections was incorrect under the company's governing documents. Isabella watched Lucien. He sat in his chair, the chair the room had always organized itself around, and he was very still. He was not doing the thing that people in his position sometimes do in these moments, which is performing dignified stoicism for the room. He was simply still, the way a thing is still when the energy has left it. The architecture was intact, the suit, the straight cuffs, the controlled face, but the thing that had occupied it, the absolute certainty of himself that she had mistaken for character, was gone. She could see its absence the way you see the shape of something removed. 2 of the building's security officers appeared at the boardroom door at 12:20. They were quiet about it, They stood at the door and looked at the room director general, and Patricia nodded once, and the director general looked at Lucien and said, "Lucien, you'll need to go with them now." Lucien stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the phone from the table in front of him and then set it back down. A small, strange gesture, the gesture of a man who reached for a habit and then remembered the habit was no longer available. He looked at Isabella one final time. She thought he was going to say something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his mouth prepared itself. And she was ready. She had been ready since Thanksgiving night. Ready for whatever final repositioning he would attempt, whatever version of the story he would try to leave in the room. He said nothing. He walked to the door. The security officers fell in beside him without touching him, which was a courtesy he would not remember but that she noticed. And at the door he paused, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see it, and he looked back at the room. Not at her specifically, at the room. At the table, the chairs, the window behind which Manhattan's skyline continued its complete indifference to everything that had just occurred inside this glass and steel tower. Then he walked out. The door closed. The room breathed. What happened in the hours after that was procedural and exhausting and necessary, and Isabella sat through all of it because it needed to be sat through. Attorneys conferred. Documents were signed. Breslow arranged a communication to the other shareholders. Raymond submitted his forensic report to the independent counsel. Patricia and Whitfield began the framework of the criminal referral to the federal prosecutors who would, over the following months, build a case that eventually named Lucien Blackwood, Marcus Hale, Thomas Wren, and 4 other individuals across 2 countries in a fraud complaint that ran to 312 pages. She did not think about any of that in the boardroom that afternoon. She thought about what needed to happen in the next 10 minutes, and then the 10 minutes after that. One thing at a time was the only gear she had left, and she ran in it until the room finally emptied at 3:15 in the afternoon, and she was alone at the table except for Gideon, who had not left. He sat down across from her. He put a bottle of water on the table in front of her. She drank it. "How are you?" he said. She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she had energy left to think about anything. "I don't know yet," she said. "About ask me in a week." He nodded. "That's fair." She looked at the table. The document folder was still in front of her, lighter now. Most of its contents submitted to the record entered into the formal machinery of consequence. She pressed her hand flat against the leather and felt the remaining pages beneath it. "He never loved me," she said. It was not a question. It was not a complaint. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they have known something for a while and are finally saying it in the full light. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what he felt," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't think he knows either." "It doesn't matter," she said, and meant it. That was the surprising thing, how completely she meant it. The question of what Lucien felt had stopped mattering somewhere in the middle of the night, reading documents at Gideon's kitchen table. What mattered was what he had done, and what could be proven, and what could be protected. Feelings were not the architecture. They never had been. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby was awake, moving in the sustained, emphatic way that she had come to understand was his response to hours of tension, as though her body transmitted the stress downward, and he pushed back against it the only way he could. "We need to go," she said. "I have an OB appointment I missed on Wednesday. I need to reschedule." Gideon stood. "The car is downstairs." She stood. She picked up the document folder. She looked at the room one more time, the oval table, the chairs, the window with the skyline behind it. And she allowed herself one moment to simply be in it. Not triumphant, not relieved, just present, in the room where it had ended, with the full weight of what had happened and the full weight of what came next resting in equal measure on whatever she was made of. Then she walked out. The following weeks were not quiet. Quiet was not a thing available to her yet. There were attorney meetings and medical appointments and a deposition in which she sat across a table from a federal prosecutor and answered 4 hours of questions about the trust structure, the Thanksgiving recordings, and the events of the 48 hours between the night she found the phone and the morning of the board meeting. There were days when the financial press ran stories that required response, and days when her phone did not stop, and days when the sheer procedural weight of dismantling a corrupt empire made her so tired she sat on the edge of her bed at 9 in the evening and could not remember what she had eaten. She moved to Connecticut. She went back to her father's house, the house where she had grown up, the house where she had learned what she learned and forgotten what she forgot, and was now, in some sense that she could only partially articulate, trying to remember. She had the nursery here repainted. She assembled a new crib herself, standing on a step stool that she probably shouldn't have been on at 34 weeks, because she wanted to be the one to assemble it. The crib in the Manhattan penthouse she left behind. All of it. She had her clothing and her books and her father's address book sent to Connecticut by a service, and she did not return to the building herself. There was nothing in it she needed that she couldn't live without, and there was nothing she could think of that she wanted to carry forward from that specific physical space into whatever space she was building now. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning in December to tell her that the federal prosecutors had formally opened the investigation. Lucien's assets were frozen pending review. Marcus Hale had retained separate counsel and was understood to be cooperating with investigators, which Patricia noted with the dry specificity of a woman who had seen this particular sequence many times and found the predictability of it more sad than satisfying. Thomas Wren had resigned from the firm and was also cooperating. Isabella listened to all of this on the phone in the kitchen of the Connecticut house, standing at the counter in her father's kitchen, and she said, "Thank you, Patricia." And then, "How long before we know the outcome?" "Federal fraud cases at this scale. Years," Patricia said. "I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," Isabella said. "Years is fine. I have time." She had more time than she'd thought. That was one of the unexpected discoveries of those weeks. The discovery that time, which had felt so compressed in the 48 hours of the fight, had expanded again into something spacious and navigable. She had months before the birth. She had the Connecticut house. She had Gideon, who called twice a week and had taken to working remotely from a house he'd rented in the same town, appearing at her kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday mornings with his laptop and his tea and his particular quality of useful silence. She had the legal standing her father had spent 20 years building for her, and she was beginning to understand it. Not as an abstraction, not as documents and certified copies and the language of beneficiaries and irrevocable instruments, but as a real thing, a structural thing, the kind of ground that holds because it was built to hold even when everything above it was being torn up by the roots. She started working. Not because she felt obligated, not because the attorneys said she needed to be visibly engaged, but because she wanted to, and because she found, to her considerable surprise, that she was good at it, better than she'd known. She had grown up watching her father read contracts the way other people read novels, for pleasure, for the specific pleasure of understanding how things fit together. And she had absorbed more of that than she had realized. She spent December rebuilding her understanding of the actual businesses, the ports, the freight companies, the logistics networks that ran through the Ashcroft holdings. She had conference calls with port managers, and she flew, carefully, at 36 weeks, her OB present on the phone for the duration of the flight, to inspect the New Jersey terminal herself, standing on the loading dock in a hard hat with her coat open over her belly, listening to the terminal manager explain the daily operations, asking questions, taking notes in the small leather journal that had been in her bag since Thanksgiving night. The terminal manager's name was Dale. He was 63 and had worked the Ashcroft docks for 27 years, and when she arrived, he had looked at her with the specific wariness of a man who has been uncertain of his employment for 8 months and doesn't know if the person walking toward him is the solution or the next problem. She shook his hand and said, "Tell me what's broken and what you need to fix it." And he looked at her for a moment with a recalibrating expression, and then he started talking, and she listened, and 2 hours later, when she was walking back to the car, he said quietly, not performing anything, "Your father used to do that. Ask what was broken first." She looked at him. "I know," she said. She drove back to Connecticut in the January dark. Her son was born on a Thursday morning in late January in a hospital in Hartford, after 11 hours of labor that she described afterward as the most honest thing she had ever done, because there was no way to perform it, and no way to manage how much it cost, and no way to be anything other than exactly what she was. She had Gideon in the waiting room. She had Patricia, who had no medical reason to be there, and was there anyway, reading briefs in a plastic chair with the focused calm of a woman continuing to work because she did not know how to stop. She had a midwife named Constance, who had the specific gift of presence that makes people feel less alone in large things. She did not call Lucien. There was a legal protocol around communication given the ongoing investigation, and she followed it precisely, and she felt nothing about following it except a distant administrative kind of relief. Her son was born at 11:42 in the morning. He weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He was red-faced and furious about being born in the particular way of newborns who have opinions about their circumstances, and the sound he made when he arrived was the most important sound Isabella had ever heard in her life. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was proof. The most fundamental and irrefutable proof of something she had been fighting for in the dark for months without being able to see it clearly. He was here. He was real. He was hers. She held him against her chest and felt his weight, the specific, dense, urgent weight of a new person. And she did not think about Lucien, and she did not think about the board meeting, and she did not think about the trust documents, or the recordings, or the 87-page fraud complaint. She thought about nothing except the weight in her arms, the sound of his breathing settling from frantic to something slower, the specific texture of his hair against her chin. She cried. For the first time since Thanksgiving night, she cried. Not for what she'd lost. She had done most of the accounting on that and knew its dimensions. But for this. For the fact that despite everything that had been arranged against it, this had happened. He had arrived. Intact and furious and entirely, completely unaware of any of it, which was the most beautiful thing about him. She named him William. She had known she would from the night she sat on the nursery floor in the Manhattan penthouse, holding the baby blanket and thinking about her father. The name did not need explanation, and she did not offer one to anyone who asked. The months after his birth were different from the months before. Not easier. She was running a company and managing a federal investigation and raising a newborn and doing all of it in a state of permanent low-grade exhaustion that she was told would ease, and that eased very slowly. But different. The urgency of the fight had changed character. It was still there, but it had become somehow workable, a thing she carried rather than a thing she was buried under. She made changes at the company, slowly, and then more quickly, as she understood what needed changing. She removed 3 executives whose involvement in the Meridian structure could be documented. She reinstated 2 long-term managers who had been sidelined under Lucien's administration for reasons that, on review, she understood to be political rather than performance-based. She began a transparency audit of all subsidiary companies, publishing quarterly results on the company's website, something Lucien had never done. Something she did because she had found, sitting in Gideon's kitchen reading documents at 2 in the morning, that the thing she hated most about the past 3 years was not the deception, but the darkness it required, and she had no interest in perpetuating any version of it. Gideon stayed. He had not said explicitly that he was staying, but he was there on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and increasingly on other mornings as well, at the kitchen table with his laptop and his tea, and occasionally William in the small bouncy seat beside him while Isabella took calls. And the arrangement was never formally discussed because it did not need to be. Some things settle into place by use. On a Tuesday morning in April, William 11 weeks old, the Connecticut yard coming back from winter, the earliest green appearing in the trees along the property line, she found Gideon at the kitchen table reading a document she didn't recognize. "What is that?" she said. He looked up. "The final trust audit," he said. "Raymond finished it. Everything is accounted for." He set it on the table. "Including the assets that moved through Meridian. The forensic trail is complete enough that the federal case will seek full recovery." He paused. "You'll get it back. Most of it. The $63 million and the compounded interest. It won't be this year, but it will be recovered." She poured coffee. She sat down across from him. William was asleep in the bouncy seat in the corner, his face slack and peaceful, one small fist closed against his cheek. "My father would have liked to know that," she said. "I think he knew it was possible," Gideon said. "That's why he built it the way he did." She looked at her coffee. "He built it for me," she said. "Not for the money. Not for the business." She looked at the corner where her son was sleeping. "He built it because he knew I'd need somewhere to stand." Gideon looked at her across the table. "And did it hold?" She thought about the bathtub and the dark apartment, and the car going north in the Thanksgiving night, and the kitchen in Hudson, and the boardroom, and the 87 pages, and the vote. She thought about all the places she had stood over the previous 5 months, and whether any of them had held. "Yes," she said, "it held." The foundation gala was in September. She had not planned to attend, she had not planned to speak. But Anita Breslow called in August and said simply, "The people who supported this company through a very difficult year would like to hear from you. Not a statement, just your voice, just you in the room." And Isabella had thought about it for 2 days and then called Breslow back and said yes. She wore the same navy suit she had worn to the boardroom in November, altered now for a body that had been through something and emerged from it slightly changed. And she carried William on her hip because he was 7 months old, and she had no intention of leaving him with anyone on a night that mattered. He had attended the previous 2 board meetings the same way, in a front carrier, occasionally asleep and occasionally awake, and opinionated about the acoustics in corporate conference rooms. The ballroom was full. The Manhattan skyline was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, lit and enormous and indifferent, the same skyline she had watched from the car going north on Thanksgiving night, the same city that had arranged itself around the very specific gravity of wealth and ambition and story that she had grown up in. She stood at the podium with William on her hip. She looked at the room, the board members, the business partners, the foundation donors, the employees who had stayed through months of uncertainty. She had notes on the podium that she did not look at. "A year ago," she said, "someone who knew me very well, or believed he did, told an associate that I didn't understand what I held." She paused. "He was right. At the time I didn't, but I'd like to think the past year has been an education." A few people smiled. She let the pause hold for a moment. "My father spent 20 years building something I was too young to understand. He didn't have enough time to explain it to me properly. But what I've come to understand is that he wasn't primarily building a business. He was building a position, a place to stand that no one could remove me from, even if I didn't know it was there yet." She felt William shift against her hip, one hand fisting in the fabric of her jacket. "I know it now." She looked at the room. Not at any single face. At the room itself, the assembled weight of it, the specific community of people who had decided to remain even when remaining was uncertain. "Betrayal is not the end of a story," she said. "It is the place where you find out what the story is actually about." She let that settle. "I found out what mine was about. I would not have chosen the way I found out, but I'm grateful for the finding." She did not say more than that. The notes on the podium remained unread. She stepped back from the microphone and the room began to respond, and she felt William's hand tighten in her jacket, a small fist full of her navy fabric, holding on the way new people hold on to what they trust. And she put her hand over his and stood in the light of the ballroom with the city behind her and the year in her, and let the sound of the room reach her without managing it, without framing it, without performing any particular response to it. She just stood there, in the mess and the weight and the hard-won presence of herself. Outside, the city moved. The river was out there in the dark, as it always was, it wide and cold and moving north, the same direction she had traveled on the worst night, and it turned out the right one. William fell asleep on her shoulder before the applause finished. She let him sleep.